Friday the 13th. I know what you're thinking, unlucky. But sometimes it's not such an unlucky day. On that particular Friday the 13th, 2005, I can't remember if my wife and I woke up with any kind of awareness of impending doom, or if we felt like there was an omen that hung over our collective heads. I can't remember if I woke up first. Can't remember what I had for breakfast. I can't remember if the sun was shining or not. I cannot remember a lot of things about that day. However, I will never forget that we spent much of that entire day looking for Mary. You see, my parents collect porcelain figurines, more specifically religious figurines, even more specifically Catholic religious figurines. In 2004, Hurricane Ivan hit the Florida Panhandle. Mom and Dad were living in Mary Esther. Ivan flexed his muscles over the coast. Mary Esther was hit hard. Mom and Dad's house was out for the count. They lost pretty much everything, including many of their porcelain figures, including Mary, their favorite piece. A piece of porcelain that my sister made when she was in junior high school. I remember my sister Liz bringing home that Mary. Mary, alone in her robes, hands gently held outwards as if inviting an embrace. It was beautiful in its simplicity. We siblings were jealous of it. It was a Monet of a porcelain figurine, fragile, soft lines, even softer colors, pale blue and cream. I, my brother and sister, daren't even touch it, should we ruin the grace that seemed to envelop it and radiate from it. A year after Hurricane Ivan, while holidaying on the island of Menorca, Spain, my wife Tamsin and I happened along the Ladro Factory. Now, Ladro is one of the biggest porcelain manufacturers in the world. They have a flagship store on Piccadilly, a few doors down from Fortnum and Mason. They produce pieces that adorn stately homes, museums, and palaces. With Ladro being one of my mother's favorite porcelain manufacturers, and knowing that Mom and Dad would more than appreciate the figure of the Virgin Mary, it was one stop we couldn't afford to miss. We were going to find Mom and Dad a replacement for the figurine of the Mother of Jesus. The one that was taken away, ironically, by what most insurers would classify as an act of God. We walked into the Aladdin's cave of porcelain figurines, Catholic and not. There were cats and dogs, cars and planes, horses and hounds, and yes, plenty of Jesuses and Marys. The problem, we discovered there was just way too many. You could have had your pick of Marys. Mary holding the child Savior, Mary leaning over the swaddled Messiah, Mary, arms outstretched, blessing the new arrival, Mary's hands clenched together in prayer, Mary and Jesus holding hands, Mary and Jesus not holding hands, Mary praying hands together, Mary praying hands apart. However, we couldn't find anything resembling the Mary asking for a hug. We decided that we would abandon our search and call Mom and Dad, report our findings, that we had found the Virgin Mother Lode, and described the best of our ability the Marys that we found that day. So we went back to our apartment and decided to have a little snack before supper. Tamsin cracked open a Diet Coke, Jack cracked open a can of cashews, I cracked open a beer. Life was good for all of about 30 seconds. Jack had eaten nuts all his life. Nothing gives an American father more pride than introducing his son to his first baseball game, his first viewing of Star Wars, his first peanut butter and jelly sandwich, all of what we had done. When Jack came running into the room with a look of panic on his face and saying, "Mommy, Daddy, I don't feel good," we just thought what most parents would think, that he'd eaten something during the day, or we had too much sweets or chocolate. We didn't know. Then he vomited. Without warning, puked uncontrollably on the floor. And then he looked at me with a strange, pleading look. I knew something was wrong. Very wrong. I could see the beginnings of an allergic reaction, and so could Tamsin. Instinctively, I turned to Tamsin and I said, "He's allergic to nuts." This is when I would like to say that we handled things with ease. I would like to say that my wife and I were the personification of assuredness, calm, and serenity. I really would like to say that. However, I turned to Tamsin and I said, "Get some help." I mean, really? This is the best I could come up with? Come on, I'm an actor, for Christ's sake. I've played doctors on screen and stage. I've watched endless doctor procedurals on television. And for all that time, all I could come up with was get some help. I picked up Jack and took him downstairs to a waiting car. Tat managed to scream so loudly that we needed help, we actually had our choice of car. I chose the four-door driven by a man called Dave. We knew him from previous visits to the villa. There was also a woman ushering him into the car. We instructed Dave to get us to the nearest hospital as quick as he could. Jack, at this point, was beginning to panic. White blood cells and a rash were now appearing all over his body. As we started to pull away, the woman asked, "What's wrong? What's happened?" My wife said he ate a cashew nut and started vomiting. We think he's allergic to nuts. "Stop the car," she shouted. The last thing I wanted to hear. I didn't want Dave to stop the car. I wanted to step on the gas. Get us to the hospital, Dave, come on. "Stop the car," she shouted once again. Before I knew it, she was out of the car and running back into her villa. Dave waited patiently. The more I think about it, the more I am convinced that Dave must have been a cabbie in his former life, because he was acting as if this was just another day. His fare was ticking away and he really didn't want to get to know the details. He only wanted to know where he needed to go. The woman jumped back in the car and produced an EpiPen, which I'd never seen before. An EpiPen is a shot of adrenaline in an auto-injector form. She said, "My granddaughter is allergic to nuts. I just happen to have this one in my bag. I've never used one of these before, but maybe it's useful?" Collectively, we read the instructions. I mean, I can't remember who administered the shot, but whoever it was, Jack was not happy with them as the needle was fired into his leg. We arrived at the hospital. In the waiting room was a mixture of old Spanish people whose ailments were probably best described as old age and not knowing who they were because of old age. And then there were the English patients, most with severe cases of sunburn, others who had been cut by a beer bottle or fallen over after a big night out. We sat next to a kid that had the worst case of chickenpox we'd ever seen. By this time, Jack had settled down a bit. Whatever the EpiPen offered Jack's body had accepted it. Only it had taken us about a half hour to get seen by the next available doctor, and when they called us in, we could see that Jack was beginning to have another reaction. The doctor asked us what happened, and we told him. He looked worried. We began panicking again. He said, "Take him to the island's main hospital and hurry." We were off again. Jack took a turn for the worse. He began panicking. His entire body was covered with white blood cells. He couldn't stop moving, convulsing. Dave, our cabbie, turned into a Formula One driver. I don't think he stopped for a single stop sign or red light. He got us to the hospital in 15 minutes, not the 30. Apparently, it's still a Menorcan island record. Tamsin charged into the hospital carrying Jack, who was limp at this point, shouting, "Anaphylactico, anaphylactico, help!" Now, I'm not Spanish, and I'm not sure, but I don't even think anaphylactico is a word. Tat was followed in immediately by the woman from the car. Now, this is when time started to slow down, really slow down. Tat disappeared with Jack, running into the emergency room, or rather what the hospital had at their disposal as an emergency room. We would later learn that this hospital was not equipped for the sort of emergencies that we had presented to them. From beyond the double doors of doom, I could hear my son crying. Actually, that's a bit of a lie. He wasn't crying. He was screaming, yelling, pleading. I did what any sensible man would do in this situation. I called my mother-in-law. I didn't know what was going on, but I needed help. As soon as she answered, my wife came out of the double doors in tears, ushered by a nurse, I honestly thought that she was going to tell me that we had lost Jack. But I was beckoned by the nurse. Tamsin was asked to stay outside. I didn't know what this meant. Was it good? Was it bad? I went into the emergency room, and Jack already had 2, 3, 4 needles in him. He was distraught, surrounded by people in white coats, poking and prodding, and every passing minute brought another doctor into the room, running through the doors. The most distressing part of this was that the medical attendees never spoke English. Now, I took 3 years of Spanish in high school, and I graduated in California, which means that if you didn't know Spanish, you didn't graduate. And I didn't have the faintest clue what was being said in that emergency room. What I did know was that at one moment there were 2 junior nurses. And when I think about it now, they looked so young. They turned and looked at each other, and then they both started crying. The tears were rolling down their cheeks, literally. These 2 wonderful junior nurses, surrounded by the best that this foreign hospital had to give to make sure my son lived, they were crying. And I wasn't feeling very confident. Then, I cannot explain what happened next. I can only tell you what happened next. I left my body, genuinely and seriously. And I knew in an instant why people have out-of-body experiences. It's because their heart, their mind, their soul cannot take what is presented them as the present reality. I floated in the corner of that emergency room, watching myself watch my son die. Jack looked at me in the corner. He stared me straight in the eye, not to where my physical body was, but where my heart had sought refuge. He said, "Daddy." One word. One word. I couldn't tell whether it was a question or a statement, a plea or an affirmation, an assurance or an acceptance. But what I did know is that I had to answer. "I love you," was all that I could think to say. What else could I have said? Jack didn't say anything else. He stopped crying and lay back in the hospital bed. No more screaming, a steely look of determination in his face. My 3-year-old boy lay down, looked at me, and let the doctors do whatever they needed to do. In the middle of all the beeps and whistles, the pediatrician in charge came over to me and said in a thick Spanish accent, "They normally either fight or give up. Your son fights. He's going to be okay." I walked out, numb. I found Tamsin and gave her the most true hug a husband can give his wife. The woman from the car came up to us. She'd changed her clothes. When did she have the time to change her clothes? How long were we in there? She told us that she was going out to dinner and wanted to know how Jack was. I told her that the doctor said that he'd be okay. She said, "Great," and said goodbye. I stood there and took her in. This was the woman that gave us the precious minutes that saved our boy's life. Without her, this story would have a much different ending. As she started to go, I said to her, "Excuse me." She stopped and turned and waited. I searched for something clever to say, something more than a simple thank you. I came up with a very clever thank you. Thank you so much. She didn't say anything in her modesty. I followed her out to the parking lot. "I don't even know your name," I called out, guiltily. "It's Mary," she said. She got into her car. Stunned, I recalled our journey earlier in the day. I watched her drive out of the hospital car park. I followed the car until I couldn't see it anymore. I took out my mobile phone, dialed Mom and Dad's number in America. This was one phone call. It was definitely going to be worth the roaming charges. "Hello?" My father's voice boomed across numerous time zones. "Dad, I think I found your Mary."